Bitch by Jason Bradford. Chapter 10. Changes. Nightfall came swiftly. Boris was awake and sat on the small, narrow, yet tall tree stump Jack had found and set up for him to use as a makeshift chair. Boris was grateful and loved it. The three of them devised a plan that was simple, yet gave them all great confidence that the trip to Jack's house and back to the clearing would go without any complication. Jack and Karen walked through the forest with Boris overhead. There was no sign of the other werewolves. They reached Jack's house. Jack wasn't sure what to do, but he was relieved when he was confronted with only a few fans of Karen. It could have been worse. It could have been the police. Jack ran into his house while Karen stayed out front. Sue and a few other fans circled around Karen. They rubbed her arms and tousled her fur. Sue reached out and scratched Karen's stomach, which caused Karen's leg to scratch the other side of her stomach involuntarily. Everyone laughed, and Karen panted in delight. Karen found a bond forming between Sue and the others. Nothing major, just a comfortable exchange of communication and respect that she hadn't expected from humans. A few moments later, Jack came out of the house carrying a large suitcase and a duffel bag. He was wearing a backpack. He reached into his pant pocket when he reached his torso. He threw everything in the back seat and popped the trunk. He approached the small crowd and said hello. He noticed Star, the waitress, was among them. He said hello to her and Sue first, then to everyone else. "Are you leaving?" Sue asked. "Only for a few days. I'll be back in school next week," Jack answered. "Tell Courtney to lead the class and being good for the sub until I return." He smiled at her, and she smiled back at him. Jack observed how gracious and generous Karen was with her fans. He found it oddly charming. Karen turned away from everyone, headed to the car, and fell butt first into the open cavity of the car's trunk. She howled and waved goodbye to her fans as Jack drove away. Boris took his cue from the howl and appeared from the shadows where he had been hiding. He swooped down before the crowd and convinced them to return home and forget this evening happened. The crowd disappeared down the road without hesitation. Down the road and out of sight of Jack's house, Sue and Star walked together. The rest of the group that had also admired Karen was gone. "What were we talking about?" Star asked Sue. "I don't know. I can't remember." Sue paused briefly to give it a thought, and they both continued down the quiet, dark road. That night, around a blazing bonfire, Jack looked around. The forest surrounded the three of them as if it were a living entity that kept them all safe within its embrace. Jack felt serenity for the first time in as long as he could remember. Perhaps he had never felt it. His life was full of mystery, sadness, mundane days, and lonely nights. Leah had left him by death, Phil had left him by choice, and his parents had left him by means that he was unaware of. He welcomed this serenity and let it sink into his soul. This place, the clearing and the cave, tucked away in a quiet little part of the forest, made him feel like he belonged. He wondered how long it would be before someone came along and intruded. He knew it would happen eventually. Jack was surprised it hadn't happened already. Perhaps he should ask Boris to convince the town to stay away from the area, or to end up back in the neighborhood by becoming disoriented or confused if they came too close. Good idea. "Boris, would you be able to convince everyone to stay away from our clearing?" Jack explained his thoughts to Boris regarding protecting the area with magic, so no one would stumble upon it. If anyone could put a spell on this place of land, it would be a vampire with his ability to convince, even if that vampire sometimes forgot what direction was up. Boris considered it a brilliant idea, so he flew off at that moment to visit the residents of their small town. He'd start first with Star, Sue, and the most faithful fans of Karen, and spread out from there. Jack hadn't expected such a fast response. He chuckled at the "if you say jump, I'll say how high" reaction. But Jack did feel a bit better knowing that this area would be enchanted, more or less. At least as enchanted as a centuries-old vampire with self-diagnosed Alzheimer's could manage to make it. His mind continued to race with other issues that had begun to reveal themselves. Quit your job and sell your house. He didn't reject it or wince from the absurdity of the impulse thought, which shocked him more than the ideas themselves. He considered his savings account. He had saved enough money to live on for a lifetime, and without the house to worry about and all the responsibilities that go along with it, he could easily imagine himself being free from it all. But he knew this wouldn't make sense. Events and circumstances were new, and the outcome was not promised. He may need his house and everything in it, so being a carefree forest critter for the rest of his life was out of the equation. He had his car, his house, the clearing, and his den. On the other hand, he also had his wooden sofa, bonfire, and a stump perch for Boris. He only worried about the cold weather. Even with her intense body heat, how warm could Karen really keep him in the cave? This was all the more reason not to sell the house. That was a silly notion, no matter how fleeting it was. Jack smiled at the prospect of the exciting changes that he was facing. But about his job, would he give it up or stay? He only had a week to decide. He'd miss his kids sorely, and he knew someone would come looking for Ginger and Tyler, and that was the only thing that renting the house to a stranger while he was living in the shadows of secrecy, tucked away in a quiet part of the forest, and might make him look guilty of something. The clarity of his ideas clouded over. Confusion had returned. He pulled his phone from his pocket, and there it was, one missed call from Rick Serra, Tyler's father. The voicemail icon was notifying him that there was a message to be heard. His heart fell heavy, and the strong panic failed to catch it. He considered that someone would have at least contacted him about Ginger Wright, but no one had yet. Karen sat beside him as usual. It was her favorite spot. "I think I'm going to keep teaching if things work in our favor." Jack looked up at her and bit the bullet of chance. "What do you think?" Karen bared her teeth in the "I think that's a good idea" expression. "I feel like this Ginger situation has me held down in concrete shoes," Jack said, "and the waters are coming in fast." Boris flew over to them and landed on Karen's shoulder. "Perhaps you should reach out to her family and let them know you're just doing a wellness inquiry due to the fact that lack of constant communication you normally get from her. Pull some focus off of you otherwise." Jack pondered it a bit. "That's actually not a bad idea," Jack responded. "I'll call Amber now. In fact, it's not too late." Jack called Ginger's sister Amber. The phone rang a couple of times before she answered it. "Hello, Jack," Amber said. "Hi, Amber. I'm calling because I'm a bit concerned." He felt guilt and fear as he played this game. The accomplice's cat playing with the victim's mouse. "I haven't heard from Ginger, and that isn't like her." "I'll be that way in a couple hours. I can swing by her place and see what's up with her," Amber told him. "I sent her a text a couple of hours ago, but she hasn't responded. It is a bit odd. And now that you mention it, my mind is going to dark places." Jack considered Amber's personality to be in contrast with Ginger's. It was amazing how sisters as close as Amber and Ginger were, raised in the same house by the same parents, could be so different. "Thank you, Amber." "Of course." Amber hung up. Jack felt a little nervous about what he had done. He hoped he hadn't poured more cement on his feet. Nearly 3 hours had passed since he hung up the phone with Amber. The illusion of dancing breezes and magic silence shattered, and Jack felt the enormous weight of his concrete shoes when Amber finally sent him a text message. A text? That was odd. He was sure something this urgent would warrant a call. Nonetheless, there it was. No turning back now. Ginger would be listed as missing, and there would be an investigation. The fire continued to blaze before them. The flames were tall and powerful, and everything in the clearing danced in its colors. Shadows waltzed with the breeze around the trees. Jack held his cell phone in his hand with a small battery pack hanging from it, connected by the short black cord. There it was, blaring back at him, the message from Amber. Jack read the text message aloud for everyone to hear. "Jack, it's Amber. I'm afraid I have some terrible news. We fear Ginger committed suicide." Karen looked down at Jack. Boris flew from his stump and over to the fire and took perch upon Karen's shoulder once more so he could be closer to them. "We found a suicide note in the middle of a shrine she had put up with photos of you," Amber's message continued. "Can't bring myself to talk about it with you right now. We'll call you in a few days after we sort some details and spend time with Mom and Dad." Jack read slowly. A realization took hold of him. He felt his concrete shoes crack a little. Jack was ashamed that his first feelings were that of relief. A family was going to mourn their loss, and Jack was relieved that Karen's involvement may be irrelevant. Suicide. The note made sense to the family, and Jack hoped that it would be enough. He had no other choice but to let it be, for now anyway. The breeze moved as if it were a living entity. It swirled softly around Jack and Karen. He closed his eyes and enjoyed the deliciousness of the moment. He reached over and put his hand on Karen's large paw. He let the silence continue to be his music. Jack pulled a suitcase full of clean pants, Oxfords, and boxers. Downstairs in the utility room at the back of the house, the dryer was tumbling a load of clothes. A few remaining dirty clothes from the prior few days were being agitated in the washing machine. Karen stood in the backyard enjoying the soft breeze billowing through her long blonde fur. She smelled the honeysuckle in the air. The summer mid-spring air was chilly, but it felt wonderful. Jack looked over at the window. The ledge where Michael J. Fox liked to play lazy cat was empty. He missed him and worried about his silly sidekick. He hoped he was okay wherever he had disappeared. The sky on the other side of the window was whispering the promise of nightfall. The early transformation had the sky a dark orange and red beyond the nearby darkening blue that was fading into purple. A knock at the front door snapped Jack out of his thoughts of his cat. Leaving the suitcase open, he galloped in a happy trot down the stairs. Karen was entering the house through the back glass sliding door. "I got it!" Jack smiled and watched Karen go back into the backyard. He figured it was a fan of Karen, perhaps. The door opened, and Sherry, a black woman in her early 60s, was standing there. She was dressed in a starched navy blue police uniform. She smiled slightly as she spoke. "Jack Naughton?" she asked. Before he could answer, she continued, "I'm Officer Locke. I'd like to ask you some questions about Tyler Sarah," she said with the direct eye contact. As she stepped over the threshold, she added, "May I come in?" Taken off guard at her premature entry without a response from him, he swiped his arm in the come-in motion. Sherry walked past him. They both sat side by side on the sofa with their knees facing toward each other. "Mr. Sarah was due in Barcelona for a funeral, and he never made the flight." She began the conversation with the point and kept the sharp edge during her dialogue, although there was a kindness about it. "The last person known to see him is you. Do you know where he is?" "Yes," Jack said without delay, feeling a bit dismayed at how quickly she got to the point. "Would you mind if I have Karen join us?" Sherry knew about Karen. She had seen her on the news. When Jack mentioned her name, chills of excitement ran through her. She was hoping she'd meet the werewolf. Who in their right mind wouldn't? She justified to herself. Sherry hoped that Jack hadn't seen her body language shift in a way that would give away her childlike thrill. Not at all, Sherry poised as nonchalantly as she could. She thought she sounded convincing in her bland, neutral delivery, but she felt giddy. Jack excused himself and walked through the kitchen to the back door and fetched Karen, leaving the large glass door open a few inches. They returned together with Karen behind Jack. Her head was completely visible over his, and Sherry felt her heart beat faster. "She's so beautiful," she thought. "So," Jack continued as he sat back down, "you were asking about Tyler." Karen continued to stand, staring at Officer Locke in a way that offered no emotion or clue as to what she may be thinking or feeling or planning. "She is so beautiful," Karen thought. "Yes," Sherry replied. "You have confirmed you know his whereabouts." "Tyler is dead," Jack said dryly yet nervously. "Karen killed him." Officer Locke sat still, unable to process such a fast admittance. She changed her attention from Jack to Karen. Jack sighed and exhaled twice as much air as he had inhaled. He felt his mind find peace as a weight was being released. Officer Locke was at a loss for words beyond that single syllable. "Karen killed him," Jack went on, "and then Ginger. She's my crazy ex-girlfriend who showed up with a gun and threatened to kill me. So Karen killed her in defense, tore her apart in my kitchen, and ate some of her heart. We dropped her body in the swamp after we wrapped her in a blue tarp and bricks, and then we drove her vehicle off a steep ravine far out in the woods. I'd been living with Karen in the woods, where there's a creature terrifying enough to scare a werewolf, and we just came back here to do laundry and pick up some things. And you have impeccable timing, as I was trying to avoid this moment. Oh, and Michael J. Fox is missing." He looked at her and waited for her to process all of it. Karen looked at Officer Locke and waited for her to process all of it as well. "You know," Officer Locke said, standing up from the leather sofa, "I have to report all of this, and..." Before she could finish her sentence, Boris flew in from the open back door. With great stealth and precision, he hovered with great stillness at Officer Locke's eye level. She stared at the bat, and before she could react, it spoke. "You are relaxed, and not at all surprised or scared," Boris told her. "You are going to leave this house, and you are going to recall this interview, leaving you convinced that Jack and Karen know nothing about Tyler Sarah, Ginger, or anything else that you discussed. You know he is innocent, and you will never consider him a person of interest." "I understand, and I agree," Officer Locke confirmed. "And when you get to the station," Boris added, "when people ask you what Karen was like, you will remember her as kind. You will show them the selfie of the three of you that you will take before you leave and tell them that it was exciting for you to see the werewolf and the human, but that they are cleared of suspicion. You will also tell Mr. Sarah, Tyler's father, that his son was here and that you spoke briefly with him before he suddenly left. You will tell Mr. Sarah that his son is well and will be in touch soon with an explanation, and that he sends his apologies for missing the funeral." Officer Locke nodded in understanding. Boris broke eye contact with the officer and flew away so fast out the back door that Sherry never saw him exit. In an instant, her memory of him was erased. "So," Officer Locke said, "I thank you for your time." She walked to the door, opened it, and paused before leaving. Officer Locke turned around and faced Jack and Karen. "Would it be an imposition if I asked both of you for a selfie before I go?" The following week found Jack full of scary and yet exciting changes. He hadn't been a suspect with Ginger at this point, and that gave him more confidence to keep moving forward. He had a meeting with Principal Ritchie that went more in Jack's favor than he had expected. Jack had a few weeks of personal time left to take, so he extended his time off with an immediate 4-week vacation. The ultimatum he gave Ritchie was that he would dissolve his position in the school if he wasn't granted his personal extension during his current time off. Wanda wasn't doing well. Her movements were slower and appeared more stiff than before. She moaned silently with every twist or lift of her body. Jack could see the changes and knew her arthritis was not going to get any better. Karen could sense Jack's worry, even from outside the house, where she hid in the shrubs. There was something else, too. The smell of something emitted from the window. The scent was familiar, but Karen couldn't quite put her claw on it. She closed her emerald eyes and inhaled. Even with her canine senses being fully utilized, the familiarity of what she was smelling was never more than just that, a familiar noxious odor that couldn't be realized. When Jack left Wanda, he was sullen and quiet. Karen felt bad, but knew that leaving him in peace was the best thing for him. She walked in the thick of the forest beside him, but with no interaction of any kind. The black Toyota Avalon pulled into the driveway next door to Jack's house. The house at the end of the street, which had stood without occupants for nearly a year, looked to be finally getting a family. Jack had heard that the house was finally rented out. He stood on his lemonade porch and waved at the young lady as she got out of her car. At the same time, from the back seat, a boy who looked to be about 6 years old also got out and ran around the front of the Avalon as fast as his short legs would carry him. The sandy, blonde, precocious-looking little boy took his mother's hand and then quickly found their way to the front door of their new house. The young lady turned and acknowledged Jack, who was already waving and smiling at them. "Hello," he shouted across the 2 yards. The young mother waved back and smiled in exchange for his smile. The little boy stood by her side. His head was pressed against his mother's hip, as if shy at the strange man who lived next door. The weather was warm and the sun was bright. The birds were active, enjoying the heat. Red-winged blackbirds and cardinals were in abundance. An occasional robin or finch was also in attendance. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s. Her hair was raven black and straight. Light bounced from it, giving it one of the most lustrous shines Jack had ever seen. She had a light olive complexion. Large sunglasses covered her eyes, making it impossible to tell the color, but he guessed they would be brown and lovely. The new neighbors entered the house next door, and the door closed gently. Without a sound strong enough to travel the 2 yards to Jack's ears. Nearly an hour had passed. Jack was inside his house, getting a few things and readying his return to the clearing. Karen was in the house, too. Jack stepped out of the shower, towel dried, and stepped into new clothes, put on his shoes, and headed downstairs. He was surprised to see the new neighbors in his living room with Karen. "I hope you don't mind," the mother said. "I knocked, and she invited us in." Jack's neighbor looked to Karen to indicate that she was the one who let them in. "Of course not," Jack replied, walking over to her to shake her hand. The young boy was standing beside her, but obviously enthralled with Karen. "My name is Jack." "Hi, Jack. My name's Elizabeth," she offered. "And this young whippersnapper is my son, Dylan." Dylan continued to spy out from behind his mother. Jack knew what it was like to be an introvert. This young man displayed characteristics that suggested Dylan may be just that. "Hello, Dylan." Jack smiled at him. Dylan offered a small grin in return. Jack knew that if they stayed long-term, Elizabeth and Dylan, that in a couple of years he would be the boy's teacher. That is, if he was still at Hamilton Elementary teaching, of course. "Would you like to meet Karen?" he asked the boy, but directed it toward both of them. Dylan's face lit up, and his smile beamed. He stepped out from behind Elizabeth and nodded to confirm that he would love to meet the werewolf. As if no longer shy, the boy was quickly standing before Karen, who looked down at him and snarled playfully. The boy giggled in delight as he was being lifted by the werewolf and held in her arms the way a mother holds her child. Dylan reached out and touched Karen's face. Her blonde fur smoothed out under his small hand as he traced her muzzle and felt the delicacy of her white whiskers, which he hadn't noticed before. Dylan, Elizabeth said, don't overtake your invite to meet her. Jack smiled at Elizabeth. He noticed her eyes now that her glasses had been removed, and he was right, brown and lovely, almond-shaped. Karen lowered the boy back down to the ground. He moved back toward his mother, only now standing comfortably beside rather than behind her. This observation confirmed that his shell could be chipped away, and within it there would most likely be an energetic, happy 6-year-old who loved to play games. If not with other children at Hamilton Elementary, then perhaps with a werewolf. Elizabeth became silent. It was as if she wanted to ask something, but was a bit standoffish about doing so. Jack noticed the body language and shift in demeanor. Is everything all right? He asked. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before giving in to her curiosity. I have a small confession. I had heard that you were the guy who brought the first werewolf back into this area in many years. She paused before continuing. And I'm sorry to pry, but do you think it might be possible for Dylan to come over from time to time? He's been very sad since his dad passed away last year, and I haven't seen him light up like this since his passing. Jack considered and was actually quite flattered by the approach and accepted the request. That was it. Considering their first impression, Elizabeth and her son seemed to be the perfect neighbors. I think that would be very nice, Jack answered. I think Karen is just as fond of him. They looked at Karen. Her tail was wagging, and she nodded her head to indicate that, yes, she was happy at the thought of playing with the boy from time to time. Elizabeth excused herself and Dylan after a few moments of chat and said goodbye. Jack walked them out and waved as they walked across his yard into theirs. Karen stood behind him, also waving. It's a hot one today, Jack yelled after them, feeling the heat from the sun. Elizabeth turned back and smiled. Global warming is real, she laughed, and so did Dylan. The mother and her son disappeared into their new home, the door closing behind them. Jack looked around and thought of Michael J. Fox, who had been gone for quite some time. He worried about his cat and hoped that he was all right.